Welcome everyone to Advancing a Vision of Asian America, the Role of Higher Education, hosted by the Asian American Research Center, the Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies Program at UC Berkeley, and AAADS community supporters. I'm Keith Kamisugi, and I will be your host for today. First, I want to thank Deborah Friedman-Lustig and Maxwell Vanderwalker for running today's Zoom. Thank you, Deborah and Max. We have the bios of our speakers and other information on the website asianamerica.vision. That's asianamerica.vision. We'll also share the recording of today's forum on that site. And before we begin, let us take a moment today to honor and grieve the 8 lives tragically taken in Atlanta 1 year ago today. 6 of the victims were Asian American women. Let us renew our commitment to stopping the epidemic of anti-Asian violence and working together to find solutions. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Lok Siu, Chair of the Asian American Research Center, to kick off the program with a welcome. Lok?
Thank you. Let me start by giving thanks to everyone who made this program possible. Keith Kamisugi, who has provided invaluable support in organizing and coordinating this event and led us through the long planning process for this forum. I also want to thank the planning committee that is comprised of community supporters, emeriti faculty, campus colleagues, alumni, and current students. And I want to thank our supporter, Minami Tamaki, Yamauchi Kwok, and Lee Foundation for providing the funding for this event. And finally, I want to especially thank Don Tamaki, who is an alum, a civil rights activist, a board member of the MTYKL Foundation, and a longtime supporter of Asian American Studies. He has been here pretty much since the program was founded 50 years ago. I welcome everyone to this program. We emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic forever changed. The dramatic rise of anti-Asian animus has shaken Asian American communities to the core. In the past 2 years, we have witnessed an exponential rise in physical violence, cyberbullying, verbal assault against Asian Americans all across the US and globally. At the same time, the political economic struggle between the US and China has created a general environment of racial mistrust and antagonism against Asian Americans. This has fueled not only the racial hate that inspires acts of violence, but also the sweeping government surveillance and overzealous prosecution of Asian American scientists, researchers, and students. Yet Asian American communities have not been silent. In fact, we have seen public mobilization, grassroots organizing, and political engagement on an unprecedented scale that crosses generations and national linguistic and class boundaries. Looking more closely, we also realize that the massive response from Asian American communities in the US and globally is only made possible by decades of teaching, research, and community engagement that have been the principal work of Asian American studies. I'm proud to say that UC Berkeley, along with San Francisco State, were the 2 institutions of higher education that led the nation by establishing the first Asian American Studies programs. More than 50 years have passed since the founding of Asian American Studies. We have trained generations of students, helped seeded numerous organizations all over, and generated immense scholarship on Asian American history, culture, and politics. We are here today to advance a new vision of Asian America, a vision for the 21st century. And we ask more specifically, what is the role of higher education in ensuring that Asian American communities continue to thrive in the decades to come? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lok. Appreciate it. Our next speaker is Hannah Chea, She is a research assistant with the AADS program and also a recent graduate of UC Berkeley.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chea. I just graduated from UC Berkeley last fall, and I currently work as an intern for the AADS program. So I took my first AADS class virtually during the pandemic, during the fall of 2020. During this chaotic time in my young adult life where I was holed up in my tiny Berkeley apartment, I felt so lost. My older Southeast Asian friends recommended I take a class on Southeast Asian history and contemporary issues, which is taught by Professor who will be speaking later. To finally learn my and my people's history, to finally learn why my Chinese Khmer parents act the way they do, and to finally learn the reason why I'm even here today. I really felt the love, the resiliency, and the healing of my classmates through that tiny computer that semester. And I'm forever grateful for AADS for blessing me with this experience and jump-starting my love for advocacy and organizing work. This is just one small story of how AADS touched my life, and I hope you enjoy hearing the other perspectives about the importance of Asian American studies during the rest of this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Our next speaker is Bao Vang. She's currently a student with the AADS program. Bao?
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Bao Vang, and I'm an AADS student and the Political Education and Community Engagement Chair for the Asian American Political Activation Program under the Asian Pacific American Student Development Office at UC Berkeley. As a Hmong American woman and a daughter of refugees, the first time I ever saw my people's history taught was in my AADS 20A class, taught by Professor Michael Omi. And for the first time ever, I felt seen in an academic setting. This is the reality of many Asian American students, especially students like me who are a minority within a minority group. This was also the first time that I learned about the Third World Liberation Front and the history of Asian American movements. And although I've always been involved in my community, learning more about Asian American history and movements in my AADS classes empowered me to dive deeper into community activism and organizing. I believe that without AADS, I would not be the person that I am today. And once again, thank you for joining us. And I hope that you are as excited as me to listen to all of the amazing speakers that we have lined up today.
Thank you, Bao. Really appreciate it. Our next speaker is Don Tamaki. And just before turning it over to Don and echoing what Lok had mentioned earlier, a large part of the reason why we're all here today is because of Don. So thank you, Don, for bringing us together and for supporting this effort. Don?
What a generous introduction. Thank you so much for having me. As the old timer on the panel, I can say that the impact of Asian American studies over the last 50 years has been transformational, both in terms of how we view ourselves and how society views us. In terms of our identity, 50 years ago, we didn't know who we were. We accepted being referred to as Orientals, which highlighted our invisibility and our second-class citizen status. We had no idea of our history or how deeply systemic racism had impacted us. Asian American studies changed that. In terms of community, Asian American studies motivated countless numbers of us to work to change our circumstances instead of allowing our circumstances to change us. Chinese for affirmative action, Filipinos for affirmative action, the Asian Law Caucus, the Asian Law Alliance, Asian Health Services, East Bay Asian Local Development Corporation, Chinatown Community Development Corporation, and many, many other institutions were formed in the wake of Asian American studies. In terms of political power and policy, Asian American studies inspired bold new leaders to emerge, including Assemblymember Phil Ting. Asian American studies prompted breaking barriers in the streets and in the suites. Blue collar and white collar workers organized in almost every occupational field, from garment and restaurant workers to medical professionals, educators, and lawyers. The tragic anniversary of the murders in Atlanta, occurring amidst hate crimes nationwide, reminds us that when the culture stokes the de-Americanization of Americans, our model minority image will not save us. The difference, though, is that the scholarship of Asian American studies has raised the consciousness of mainstream leaders and moved them to say, we've seen this movie before. In the Chinese Exclusion Act, the incarceration of Japanese Americans, the murder of Vincent Chin, and so on. So now more than ever, we need Berkeley to have a strong Asian American Studies program. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Don. I really appreciate it. At this time, we were supposed to welcome Assemblymember Phil Ting, and we did get confirmation that he is en route to this forum. I don't see him yet, so I'd like to just kind of proceed and go on to the segment with Artie, Jeff, and Koya, if that's okay with you three. Terrific. Our next speaker then is Aarti Kohli. She is the Executive Director of Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. Welcome, Aarti. Thank you for being with us.
Excuse me, my pleasure. It's an honor to be here, and I was just telling my husband I was going to be on this panel and telling him that I don't think I would even be in my job if it wasn't for the Asian American Studies department and classes that I took at UC Berkeley. I came as a child, an immigrant. I was 7 years old, and we moved to Queens, which was very diverse. But then a few years later, my parents moved us to Wheaton, Illinois, and then we moved to a suburb of in New Jersey. And in all those places, it was primarily very few people of color. And I never really felt like I belonged. And I felt very Indian, but I knew that every time I sort of, expressed who I was, it was not embraced, or, it was often looked down upon, right? And so when I got to Berkeley, it's the first time, I think, since I left India where I was like, oh, I belong here. And that notion of also just understanding my people's history in this country was so important. I had a great grandfather who actually came here in 1915 and lived in Kansas City for most of his life. And we didn't migrate because of him, but just even knowing his history here, the fact that he couldn't become a US citizen because of his race, all these things just were so informative. And just understanding, the identity of Asian American. And now in my job, I will say that it's even just more crystal clear to me that this is a political identity. And we are forming that political identity in this moment. It's been in formation for the past 50 years. And, folks like Don have been leading the charge on making sure it's an inclusive one. It's one where we're strategic and we have an idea of what values that we're going to espouse as a community, but that's in contention. And I feel like what's happening right now is people are trying to both entice and define us in terms of who we are as communities. And one of the things to acknowledge is we have just incredible diversity of history, of culture, of language, but that we have to use that as a strength and not something that's going to divide us. And that's very hard because I think one of the challenges for us is class, because we are I don't know if you all are aware, but we're the community with the biggest wealth disparity in this country. So we have some of the wealthiest people, and then we have some of the most low income and vulnerable. And, I don't have to tell you all what the model minority myth does is, hides all of those needs. So, you know, I was asked to talk about some of the challenges that our communities are facing. And in, you know, the next 2 minutes that I have left, what, Keith, can you give me a sense of time? Can you just remind me how much time I have?
Yeah, if you can wrap up in 1 minute, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm not, you can look at our website. We deal with, you know, economic justice, immigrant justice. There's all these issues. I will say what I see right now is our communities are being courted on 3 issues and divided on 3 issues. Critical race theory, affirmative action and access to higher education, including, you know, these magnet high schools, and policing. And we are basically being told that you are going to lose, and if you align with Black and Latinx communities and other communities of color, and your communities are losing at the expense of these other communities. That's the message that's going to our community. That is not something that we, I think, like, we all have to work together to counter those messages. And we're not, you know, we're not winning right now. And our communities are, I think, you know, struggling with wanting to be visible on their own needs and aligning with other communities of color. And that's what I see as a job ahead for us as leaders, as activists, is to work with our communities to both lift up our communities' needs, but also think about solutions that benefit everyone. And so, you know, I want to just thank you for including me and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Aarti, so much. Really appreciate it. We have Assemblymember Phil Ting with us now, and Phil has to run. So I'm sorry, I'm going to cut him in here and let him share his remarks. Welcome, Phil. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks, Keith. Really appreciate everyone for joining us today, and so excited to be here to follow Don, to follow Aarti. You know, we have a long, great tradition of at the Asian Law Caucus of, you know, being affiliated with Asian American Studies at Berkeley. It's been so important in my personal life. And then, of course, I'm excited to hear from my good friend Jeff Chang, who was, you know, one of my mentors at Cal back when we were raising hell and creating trouble, and spent a lot of time in Dwinell Hall talking to, you know, Professor Takaki and Professor Wong, and you know, Asian American Studies is frankly the reason I am in the legislature today. It wouldn't have happened without it. So I was so proud to help you know, work with the department and help start off the Asian American Research Center. I think it's really getting back to the core of what the department is all about, which again was founded on the basis of activism, on a connection to our community, as really the thought leaders in our community to help our community and work with our community to help solve our problems. And there's not a more important moment for Asian American Studies than today. You hear about the vitriol of all the anti-AAPI hate going on, not just in the Bay Area, but all across the country. And one of the major solutions people talk about is Asian American Studies. I was so proud to work with also a good friend, Russell Jung, as he helps launch that Stop AAPI Hate website. You know, he's a Berkeley grad, but also now a professor at San Francisco State. And it just really reinforces the need for Asian American Studies, not just here in California, but really everywhere. And we talk about why it's so important to learn about our history, not just in college, but we should have all learned about it when we were in elementary school or middle school or high school. So I really appreciate the next panel coming forward to talk about how we can make sure that Asian American Studies is in our curriculum. Now, you all know that we passed an ethnic studies requirement for high school students. I think that's just the first great step, because ethnic studies is a major step. That was a major fight. But we know that we're not done. We still have so much more to go. And that's why this last year, I was really proud as the Assembly's budget chair to champion an effort to really do one of the largest appropriations to our community of over $165 million to stop AAPI hate. And over 110 million of that will be going to community groups, hopefully like, Advancing Justice and the Asian Law Caucus, like CAA, like all the groups that Don was talking about that really have been working on hate crimes for so long, not just this last year, but really for decades. And frankly, let's just be honest, there's been AAPI hate since Asians first came here in the mid 1800s. So that's, this is not a new phenomenon. It's just a phenomenon that's getting more attention now, and it deserves that attention. But it's so critical that we have these discussions at our universities within Asian American Studies, that they're thoughtful, they're not just knee-jerk, they're not just reactionary. So really appreciate all the academic thinking that's really going on, and all the work that's going on within the department. And I'm so thankful that we could all be here today to just talk about some of the most important issues facing our community, but really how we reestablish that link between Asian American Studies and our community. It's so important. It's why it was founded, and why it exists, and why it needs to continue to flourish moving forward. So thanks so much. Really appreciate everyone for being here today, and go Bears.
Thank you, Assemblymember Ting. Really appreciate you being with us. I know you have to leave, but wanted to thank you again for joining us today. Another famous alum of the program is Jeff Chang. He's a writer, also senior advisor with the Butterfly Lab for Immigrant Narrative Strategy at Race Forward, and also a fellow Kama'aina. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Keith. Mahalo, and aloha mai kako to everybody tuning in today. So I'm a writer and a cultural strategist of Chinese and Native Hawaiian descent. And I just wanted to draw that line, right, from Phil and I taking Asian American Studies classes to becoming part of a movement to get the American Cultures requirement passed at UC Berkeley and succeeding. And that line directly to now with legislation to pass an ethnic studies requirement for all the high schools. Also want to draw a line directly from the first Asian American Studies class that I took in my freshman year to the work that I'm doing now, which is around narrative, around building power for narratives that free us all. And I'm doing a lot of work, as Keith said, with the Butterfly Lab for Immigrant Narrative Strategy at Race Forward. So I want to spend my short time today, talking a little bit about narrative in this moment as a space of crisis and of opportunity for our communities. And I want to build on some of the things that Artie was talking about in terms of this question of how we win and what does winning actually look like for all of us, for all our communities. So let's start off with this idea of narrative. What's narrative and why is it so important? Narrative is really the array or the accumulation of connected stories, messages, memes, songs, works of art that work together to speak to a particular subject or an issue or a problem. And they suggest causes, problems, and solutions. They evoke emotion. They offer us an analysis and suggest a way that we should act. They tell us how we should feel, how we should think and act about a particular kind of issue. So it's the level at which society itself moves. Narrative is a space where we activate our energies to preserve a destructive, harmful system or to build a better world for us all. So I want to argue that narrative's as important as policy or the law. Narrative change precedes political change. And that's why we have to be as strategic and rigorous in building narrative power as we are in building all other forms of power. Now, what does narrative mean for Asian Americans? Well, the whole concept of Asian American comes out of a narrative intervention, as Don was talking about, a narrative intervention reacting to othering, the othering of us as Orientals, moving instead, and this is happening at Berkeley as well, in the 1960s with Yuji Ichioka and Emma G, the Asian American Political Alliance, and students across the country beginning to call themselves Asian American as an identity to react to othering, as to say, this is who we are. The problem, of course, with that is that narrative unity, and I want you to stay on this idea of narrative unity, remember that, can create its own margins and othering. I want to come back to this point. More recently, our good friend from that era as well, another Cal student, Viet Thanh Nguyen, has talked about this idea of narrative plenitude. And what he's talking about is this need for us to be able to tell all of our stories, to move from a scarcity of our stories to plenitude. And it has consonance with the Black Lives Matter movement, which reflects a call for all of us to be seen in all of our humanity, to no longer be otherized. The downside to narrative plenitude is trying to maintain this sense of belonging, right? So I often get that the primary question among young Asian Americans to me is, what is an Asian American? Am I an Asian American, right? So we're facing a crisis of narrative in this moment that could really force us into reevaluating many of the shared narratives that have actually sustained us for the past half century. There's a lot of reasons for this. I have time to just talk about two right now: anti-Asian violence and new representation levels, new levels of representations. Anti-Asian violence, the narrative of Stop API Hate, has cast a spotlight on Asian America, and it reinforces the unity. But it's also opened up new questions among Pacific Islanders about how capacious really is this category of AAPI. On the other hand, we have these new levels of representation. Sandra Oh, it's just an honor to be Asian. We headline Hollywood blockbusters, binge TV shows, we win Grammy Awards. We are in the second highest office in the land. But how do we leverage this into power for all of us? We can't rely on the old paradigms of narrative setting. Our population has shifted. We've gone from invisibility and emergence, and we're coming into power and visibility now. So what is the narrative of Asian America now? Who belongs? Why do people identify themselves as AAPI? What values do we stand for? And how are we going to flex our power? And this points us to the question of how we think of ourselves now in this particular moment in history. We can talk about narratives as a protective stance, Stop AAPI Hate, or one as one of solidarity and culture. We can activate the values that tell us what we should be fighting for. So I just want to conclude in this moment by saying we have the opportunity to not just think of how we maintain narrative unity and build narrative plenitude, but how we develop narratives for the future. What is a vision of Asian America capacious enough to be inclusive of Pacific Islanders, to be inclusive of all other communities in a shared, equitable, expansive future of freedom for all of us? This is some of the work that we need to lean into in this moment of crisis. There's a real need for Asian Americanness and Asian American studies to step up in this moment, to understand how fast this is evolving, and to help us think about the steps that we have to take next. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Lots to think about, and Jeff threw up a link to the Butterfly Lab in the chat, and I hope folks can check that out. Thank you again, Jeff. Our next speaker is Koya Yang. She is the very first Executive Director of the California Commission on APIA Affairs. Koya, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. And thank you so much to the Asian American Research Center, AADS, and all the partners who helped to make today's conversation happen. I am a very proud ethnic studies alumnus and also really proud to be able to serve in this position as the executive director for the California Commission on Asian and Pacific Islander American Affairs. I think oftentimes, I meet ethnic studies and Asian American studies students who are unsure if this is the right major for them. And I'm here to say this is the right major for you. Just back to our commission, we are an independent state commission whose mission is to elevate the political, economic, and also social issues of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders by contributing to and also strengthening how the state government addresses the needs, issues, and the concerns of our very diverse communities. I also want to thank everyone who's speaking today, and also those who are tuning in from wherever you are. Thank you so much for all the work that you've put in, oftentimes serving as the first responder and, even maybe the only responder to our community's needs on the ground, including your very own families. This season marks the 2-year anniversary of California sheltering in place due to COVID. Also the uptick in violence against Asian Americans throughout California And as Keith mentioned earlier, the 1-year anniversary of the tragic shooting in Atlanta. We as individuals and as a community has been holding and dealing with so much pain. And I hope that everyone here has been giving yourselves grace to take pause and really reflect, because we need to make sure that we continue to feel whole. And perhaps that's why we're tuning in today, seeking for answers from each other, seeking for community and care among one another. But to kind of stay on topic of challenges and opportunities facing our community, there are many, many challenges today and ahead as we slowly come out of COVID. However, everything serves as an opportunity for structural and systemic change. From the commission, we've heard from community throughout the state regarding the challenges our families face. And these may not sound new at all. It's things that we've been fighting for decades, which includes lack of culturally relevant and linguistically appropriate services in general, especially in addressing gender-based violence and mental health access and care. Education loss from distance learning, which has exacerbated the existing issues of the lack of education attainment, especially for our underserved Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Also, want to raise up the issues that Southeast Asian communities continue to be targeted for deportation. And even when community members are coming out of prison or they are redirected to ICE detention, and if they're released from prison or ICE detention, there's very little resources available to support them. Oftentimes, they have to rely on their families and the very few handful of organizations that exist in California, like Asian Law Caucus. And of course, I know that some things that has just been in the media and has giving us so much pain lately is the ongoing anti-Asian hate and racism that we face. We've heard from communities, up and down the state, here in Sacramento, throughout the Bay, down to San Diego, from elders from our Sikh and Muslim communities, and even small farm workers throughout the Central Valley and counties north of Sacramento, in terms of the challenges and hate that they have faced with. And so, I'm glad that, Assemblymember Ting was able to speak a little bit about the API equity budget efforts, and just want to also thank you, Assemblymember Ting, and also Dr. Pan, for all of the efforts that you two have done in championing the API equity budget last year, with also like the over 200 community-based organizations who also helped to advocate, which has now really been able to create state-funded grant programs to address hate incidents and hate crimes that goes beyond just direct services, but also investing in ethnic media, peer-to-peer youth support through social media platforms, community intervention and prevention programs, as well as expanding data equity for all AA and HPI communities. In regards to opportunities, our biggest opportunities today are to strengthen how we collaborate and coordinate with each other, and also to build our young people as we're doing so. For the last decade and a half, Asian Americans and Pacific Islander communities have been asking for disaggregated AA and HPI data to help illuminate the disparities that exist. I think that this is a big opportunity for us to really be able to collaborate and coordinate with UC research institutions like the Asian American Research Center to really push out the necessary research and strong data for us to have that sort of data point to push for policy change at both the local and state level. So some of those research ideas can be like COVID impacts on the varying AA and HPI communities, education impacts on underserved AA and HPI communities. What does culturally relevant mental health services look like, or even uncovering why California's Bhutanese community has left California for the East Coast. I think those are opportunities for us to really work together to uplift and figure out how do we push for policy change so that we create a place where all of our communities feel and know that they belong. the fight doesn't end there. It also includes us needing to prioritize the healing and wellness of our communities. We have to ensure that resources and services are appropriately meeting the needs of our communities. And let's continue these conversations and convenings where we check in with each other, not just for work purposes, but also to really check in and care for each other. So to maximize on the opportunities ahead, we must center marginalized communities, let them lead, strengthen our collaboration, and love and care for each other. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Koya. Thanks for being with us today, and thanks for your continued great work on the commission. Our next trio of speakers is going to be talking about movements to advance Asian American studies, ethnic studies, Asian American history at the university and the K-12 level. Our first speaker is Monique Shino. She's with the Dartmouth Asian American Student Collective. Welcome, Monique.
Hi, thanks for having me today. I'm so honored to be among such amazing, talented activists, and just to speak a little bit about DASC. So the Dartmouth Asian American Studies Collective is really focused on advocating for Asian American studies and building resources at Dartmouth. And something that I was asked to talk about today is what is it like to do this work on the East Coast? And I think this conversation really starts in thinking about how the Asian American movements on the East and West Coast have been slightly different in their histories. Like, you know, whether we're talking about Punjabi migrant workers in California, internment, or the Third World Liberation Front, we can see that a lot of what we see as the crux of the origin of Asian American studies happens in California. And so I think what this has done at Dartmouth in particular, has manifested in a lot of area studies being prevalent versus ethnic studies, and kind of just having us in different places in terms of where we are. So currently we are in a 25-year struggle for building an Asian American Studies program at Dartmouth. And we still have no institutional home for Asian American studies. And a lot of our kind of courses that we're taking are just split apart in different departments. So what we're doing as DASC, which is a horizontally led student group, is we write, we do community building, and we really advocate for building this program. And so I guess how we started was my friend Lily Red and I had a lot of conversations around this time last year, actually, where we were talking about how important it is to have Asian American studies. And I, at the time, had never taken any classes, but Lily had. And I think just both of us being at a predominantly white institution, coming from Los Angeles, we were really growing in our racial consciousness. And I could see how much Asian American studies was doing for Lily. And as we started talking, I realized that I had never really seen myself as a subject worth studying. And as we started attending town halls and Asian American studies lectures, we asked ourselves, what could we be doing? And that's kind of where we just started to decided to start organizing a group to continue the work of students and faculty prior and advocating for building an Asian American studies program. So this past term has been very exciting. We had an article come out in the New York Times, and we also formally delivered our statement to the administration and had an actual discussion about what the possibilities are for building resources for Asian American studies, as well as actually starting a program. And they have expressed interest in building the program and plan to release a statement about their discussion with us, and also hope to put out a proposal for faculty to vote on in the fall. So things are underway, and we're very excited to share this with you. But also, we see the fight as really long from over. We are doing a lot of advocacy work to keep Dartmouth accountable, and that's kind of our mission for the rest of our existence, hopefully. And what we've been doing lately, for example, is we helped with our English department's hire for an Asian American studies or an Asian American literature senior hire, and that's been really exciting. And just like kind of coordinating between faculty, administration, and ourselves and advocating for what we want. So obviously this is very different than in the West Coast, where a lot of ethnic studies programs do incorporate Asian American studies. And I think what we would really appreciate in terms of support from any of you, if you're interested in getting involved, is to first sign our student statement, a call for Asian American studies, but also reach out to us if, for us to build relationships with you, because I think this relationship building and network building is really what's going to help us have the power and momentum to continue advocating and establishing the program. Because if you know anything about Dartmouth's history with the Asian American Studies movement, is that we are just one iteration of several groups that have tried to do this. And that kind of support is really valuable and helpful. So please reach out to us. We have an Instagram, which I can link, but that's kind of how we see ourselves operating. And just wanted to, again, express my appreciation for being able to share these kind of updates from DASC with you, and just appreciation all around for the work that everyone here and in the movement is doing, because it really does help us at Dartmouth move forward on what we hope and really ask for Asian American lives to become more legible, to be seen as worth study. And yes, so thank you so much.
Honestly, thank you so much for being with us today and for your efforts at Dartmouth. Deborah was kind enough to provide the link to the petition that Manasi mentioned in the chat, and I hope that everybody can check out the link and sign it. Our next speaker is Kate Lee with Make Us Visible. We're very lucky to have you, Kate.
Thank you, Keith. And thank you so much for sharing everything about Dartmouth. My younger sister is a proud alum of 2017, so we're cheering you on, and we're going to be following and doing what we can from our end. Hi, friends. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. My name is Kate, and as Keith mentioned, I am the co-founder and executive director of Make Us Visible. A little bit about myself first. I was born and raised in San Diego and am a product of UC Davis, where I attended my very first Asian American Studies class as a freshman undergrad. And I remember entering that lecture hall with what felt like 500 people. It probably was only 200, but it felt like a lot. And that was my first experience in an affinity space. And I remember looking at everyone, knowing no one, and but simultaneously feeling like all of our stories kind of intertwined with each other and echoed each other. And I remember Professor Hamamoto just sharing so many new parts of history that I wasn't familiar with. And I just wish that I had known this earlier. And then the older I grew, I spent the past I spent my 20s, most of my 20s, unpacking my racial identity, relearning, unlearning parts of history, and just again, wishing that I had the chance to do this earlier. After I graduated from UC Davis, I moved to Greenwich, Connecticut, and where I've been for the last 10 years. And so what was mentioned earlier about the East Coast versus West Coast journey, I see it. It's different, but all very well intentioned. And so now for the past 10 years, I've been teaching at an all-girls K through 12 school. And I noticed in the Q&A box that Sam Maraha had asked a question, and I want to say that I got to meet you in 2017 because you spoke at my school, and you continue to speak at my school every single year for our 8th grade history class, as recently as last week over Zoom. So it's been really cool just kind of seeing this space today, and hopefully in the next 2 minutes, 3 minutes, I'll be able to summarize what Make Us Visible is about. In addition to teaching middle school, I also serve as a program manager for the Asian American Education Project that houses over 50 lesson plans for parents and teachers and community members who are interested. I started working with them 2 years ago when I was the PBS Asian Americans K through 12 curriculum editor. So it's been really, really cool to see all these points of intersection in all the people doing this good work. Back in January of 2021, 2 parents and I in Connecticut wanted to come together to figure out a long-term solution in tackling and combating anti-Asian hate. And this is where we found that education would be the long-term solution. and that we wanted to be able to activate and empower our community to come together, not just to pass legislation that was inclusive, but to also directly start creating and implementing localized curriculum for folks in the state of Connecticut. When we formed Make Us Visible Connecticut, we thought maybe in a few years, another state's going to hear about us and maybe want to join the movement. Flash forward to 1 year later, we have 5 active chapters in addition to Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Florida. Most recently, New Jersey, our sister chapter there, successfully mandated K through 12 curriculum that included AAPI history. And now we are excited to share that we're about to launch our 2nd and 3rd rounds of state chapters, including New York, Rhode Island, and Maryland, all with active bills right now. And along with interest from North Carolina, some folks in the West Coast, we're going to launch Make Us Visible SoCal in late April. If folks here are interested in launching NorCal, let me know. I'll drop my email in a little bit. But again, the West Coast is, in a different space. You all are talking about ethnic studies and have mandated that already. And what has been cool is seeing how different people, all the key stakeholders, such as teachers, students, and parents, be motivated to act. I serve on the ethnic studies team for Hacienda La Puente School District. And yes, the moment AB 101 was passed, they were excited about the 2029 deadline, but they also felt like they could do it sooner. So their goal is to launch everything in 2025. And they're making moves to do that now. So just really cool things happening in all pockets of California, especially. Make Us Visible is centered on 3 main pillars: community, advocacy, and education. And we firmly believe in building our community together to empower folks to become more civically engaged. An example of that is in the state of Connecticut. While last year we were able to pass legislation inclusive of AAPI history in a K-8 model curriculum, we're trying again this year to get AAPI history as part of the general statutes. And in 2 weeks ago, within 5 days, we activated our Connecticut AAPI communities to write testimony. And we hosted an online Zoom workshop that went on for 3 hours past midnight. And within 5 days, we were able to get over 65 personalized written testimony submitted. We were able to have over 15 people testify live in a 13-hour education committee hearing that went, again, past midnight, and we stayed up till our very last speaker spoke and testified, and it was just really cool. And now our bill has moved out of the education committee successfully, and we're going to hope to maintain and boost momentum as it moves on to the appropriation stage. Simultaneously, we also just really want to bring a space for the AAPI community to come together to share their own truths and stories. Every time we gain new voices in our fold, it's parents, students, teachers who tell us, I've never done this before. I don't actually want to do this. I just kind of want to hear what you're about. And then we listen to each other's stories, and we realize for a lot of these teachers and parents especially, it's their first time talking about their racial identity in such an honest, vulnerable way. And we're realizing this is an opportunity to bring everyone together, to create a safe and brave space for folks to feel heard, seen, valued, and loved and acknowledged. Because if we can't talk about it as colleagues, as friends, as neighbors, how are we going to talk to our children about it? And how are we going to talk to our students about it? Teachers don't know what they don't know how to teach. And parents also need some guidance sometimes, and someone next to them saying, it's okay, you're not alone. And so that's a lot of what Make Us Visible aims to do. Our hope is to make sure folks know that you have a voice in this and you have a role, no matter how small or big. And this is not a partisan issue. This is a matter of education, to protect our kids, to protect our students, to help use education as a long-term solution in combating anti-bullying and anti-Asian violence. I will drop my email in the chat, and please reach out if you have any questions. And thank you for allowing me in this space today. And my only last thing is, if you haven't found the chance to, take the time to take 10 deep breaths for yourself at some point today, and hopefully every day, because I think we could all use it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. And for folks that are interested in helping Kate and Make Us Visible with the NorCal or the SoCal chapters, she'd love to have your help. Thank you very much. Our final speaker in this trio is Grace Pai, who recorded her remarks for us because she is actually doing another K-12 presentation at right at this very moment. So we're lucky to have her, and let's cue up the video.
So we passed a bill last year in 2021 called the Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History Act, or the TEACH Act. And the TEACH Act requires that all public schools in Illinois teach a unit of Asian American history starting in the 2022-2023 school year. And so it's groundbreaking because it was the first bill in the country to require Asian American history to be included in all public schools, and it's a graduation requirement. And so we're thrilled that all students in Illinois will have to learn this history regardless of whether they're Asian American or not. We feel that it's really important for students, no matter their background, to learn about the history and contributions of marginalized communities, right? When we're painted in such a particular stereotypical way in the media and are scapegoated for things like the COVID-19 pandemic, we really see education as one of the ways of combating the rise in anti-Asian hate and violence. So Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago has convened a local coalition of Asian Americans serving organizations ranging from advocacy organizations to direct service agencies for the last 10 years. And that coalition is called the Pan-Asian Voter Empowerment Coalition, or PAVE Coalition for short. And PAVE was formed actually around the 2010 census. And so it convened in 2009 to make sure that our community was counted, right? Similar to the efforts that we saw all across the country just a couple of years ago, and to make sure that our voices were heard, that Asian Americans were part of, this really important once every decade process. And since 2010, we've continued to collaborate together to make sure that Asian Americans are involved civically, that we have a voice in Springfield, our state capital, that we're advocating for issues that impact Asian Americans, that we're thinking about, what are the struggles in the Asian American community and what can we do about it? And so for every year, we have a legislative platform. And as we were developing our 2020 legislative platform, this idea of requiring Asian American history in public schools came up. It was actually before the pandemic even happened. And so we were having conversations about the importance of Asian American history in K-12 schools before we started to see the rise in anti-Asian racism related to the pandemic. And so then, of course, once the pandemic erupted and we saw just the hate and vitriol against our community, it created even more motivation and momentum for us to get something like this passed. But we did run into issues, just around the pandemic and the impact on the legislative session. So in 2020, legislators weren't really considering any legislation that was not directly related to pandemic relief. And so we had to postpone the sort of kind of full campaign from 2020 to 2021 when things were a little bit more back to normal and at least they were voting on bills again. And so we reintroduced the bill in January of 2021 and it passed in May. And our coalition partners were really critical to elevating this issue and to telling legislators, hey, look, there's really something very concrete that you can do given what's happening in our community. It ended up being incredibly timely. And in fact, the House Education Committee vote on our bill happened the day after the Atlanta shootings in March of 2021. And so, we couldn't have possibly predicted that timing, but I think it gave legislators that extra push to do something, for the Asian American community that really gets at the root causes of hate and isn't just sort of a reactionary, response to violence that's happening. I think it's really important for colleges and universities to offer Asian American studies and to have the opportunity for students to continue those courses of study that they start in high school at the college and university level. I mean, when we're talking about educating teachers and preparing them to teach Asian American history, a lot of them are starting with nothing. Because they didn't have to take any Asian American history or learn that at the college level when they're training to become teachers, right? And so there is this big gap. And I think by starting with a K-12 mandate, that can help to build the case for why we need strong Asian American history and Asian American studies courses and departments and all of that at the university level, because we need that depth, right? We need to be able to create professional development opportunities for teachers, right? For them to educate themselves and to feel like they have a really strong, pedagogical framework and grounding to then teach to high schoolers or even elementary schoolers, right? Like we need to be able to invest in that infrastructure long term. And so I'm hopeful that especially in places like the Midwest where our community just has smaller numbers, this will help to build up the case for why Asian American studies at the higher education level is so important.
Thank you. And again, that was Grace Pai, the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Chicago. Our next trio of speakers will be talking about the historic and ongoing connections and strong ties between Asian American studies and community empowerment and community organizations. Our first speaker is Dr. Tu Quach. She's the president of Asian Health Services. Tu?
Thanks so much, Keith, and good afternoon, everyone. It's truly such an honor to be in the same company with so many amazing leaders. Today, I speak to you as a proud Cal alumni, as a refugee from Vietnam, and in my new role as president at Asian Health Services. Many of you may already know about Asian Health Services. We are a federally qualified health center, but we were actually founded in 1974 by UC Berkeley students, some of whom grew up in Oakland's Chinatown. These young leaders saw that their own families and communities were not able to access quality healthcare because of language barriers and because of affordability issues. They set out to do a needs assessment and use data to advocate for creating culturally and linguistically competent care. They were influenced by the civil rights movement, and they had a lens towards social justice and honoring the basic belief that healthcare is a human right for all. Their vision and hard work gave birth to Asian Health Services 48 years ago. Today, we provide medical, dental, and mental health care to 50,000 patients in 14 Asian languages. Also importantly, we believe that the measure of our success is not just in the number of patients that we serve, but how many of them assert their right to healthcare. So our work has always been grounded in both service and in advocacy. I want to say that the last 2 years have tested us beyond belief. When COVID hit, our Asian American community was both simultaneously blamed and ignored. We were blamed for the virus and we were ignored when it came to services that we needed. And in the face of that dual pandemic of both COVID and anti-Asian racism, Asian Health Services jumped into action, keeping our clinic doors open. Our staff were out on the streets. We erected pop-up clinics in the parks, serving both our patients and community at large by providing COVID testing, vaccinations, safety, compassion, and hope. We had become more than just a trusted healthcare provider. We have become their lifeline. We had to fight for our communities to be seen and heard and to be served. This work has been so deeply personal to me. In the last 25 years, I've dedicated my life's work to serving immigrant and refugee families like my own. The last 2 years gave me the greatest clarity that there's a long road ahead of us and that we must work in unison to not only address the crisis at the moment, but to build connections and a pipeline to continue this work. My own personal story has brought me to where I am today. My family and I escaped Vietnam due to the war and arrived in the US when I was just shy of 5 years old. Our resettlement was extremely difficult. We faced poverty, language barriers, and racism. I often served as the child interpreter for my parents as they struggled through the healthcare and legal systems. My parents worked in low-income jobs and lacked access to quality healthcare, which ultimately led to their timely deaths. My mother worked in hair and nail salons that took a toll on her health, and she passed away at age 58 after a long-fought battle with cancer. My father similarly worked as an auto mechanic and suffered a massive stroke, which could have been prevented if he had good health care. As their daughter, I witnessed their struggles and their loss and grieve for their losses every single day. It's why I fight so hard to advocate for health equity, because I saw how social factors impacted their lives, just like so many of our patients. Their lived experiences have provided me with a moral compass. Now, I reflected on this a lot and realized that the critical awakening moments for me was seeded by what I learned as a student at UC Berkeley, taking courses in Asian American studies from great professors like Michael Omi and Khatharya Here I learned how my family and I, like so many others, were impacted by the US foreign and domestic policies. It was being here that shaped my political awareness and laid the groundwork for why I work at Asian Health Services and be a part of a larger movement for social justice. Now, just in January of this year, just a few months ago, my dear colleague and friend, Julia Liao, the CEO, and I, the president, stepped up to lead Asian Health Services, carrying on an amazing legacy built by our predecessors, the iconic Sherry Hirota and our original founders. In our new roles, we are not just committed to the work of our organization, but to partners, including the Asian American Studies Department at UC Berkeley, that has sent us amazing emerging young leaders for decades. We recognize not just our shared history, but also our interconnected future. Today, I come here on behalf of Asian Health Services to support this wonderful department that continues to breed great leaders in the movement. Thank you so much for letting me share my words with you.
Tu, thank you so much, and thank you for continuing the legacy and the leadership that Asian Health Services provides to our community. Our next speaker is Lilian Galedo, really an icon of our Bay Area community. She is the former executive director of Filipinos Advocates for Justice. Lilian, thanks for being with us today.
Well, I was born and raised in Stockton, California, and transferred after community college to UC Davis as part of the first major affirmative action recruitment that the university did targeting children of farm workers and the urban poor. It was 1968, and you know, the campuses were raging with political activism. I didn't intend on being an activist. I didn't know what an activist was. I just got caught up in the turmoil that was happening at the time in opposing the Vietnam War, support for farm workers through the United Farm Workers Union, and the Third World People's Movement. And through that, helped form the Asian American Studies at UC Davis. We didn't necessarily have to go on strike at Davis because that was being done here in the Bay Area at SF State and UC Berkeley. In 1976, I landed a job at UC Berkeley's Asian American Studies, running the Asian American Studies Library at a critical time in the department's development, where it was struggling to what extent it was going to continue to be a vehicle for community organizing or yield to the pressure of the university in terms of their academic direction. Then I entered the fledgling Asian American nonprofit ecosystem in the East Bay, thinking that I would work at Filipinos for Affirmative Action for maybe a couple of years, and ending up retiring there 37 and a half years later, through which I worked on building the immigrant rights movement, expanding low-wage worker rights, particularly in our community for caregivers, youth development, and participation of our community in the electoral arena. I know it's been said before, but I wanted to kind of reiterate the importance that Asian American Studies was to this nonprofit ecosystem that grew here in the East Bay. I believe that at the time UC Berkeley's Asian American Studies through the 1970s was an exceptional example of the campus community partnership. And I hope someday soon, somebody research that and documents the role that the department played in starting all the many organizations in the East Bay. One tool that was available to students at the time was that there were community classes for credit. So students could work on issues like housing and be involved in the iHotel and Project Mono, which was another housing project in Oakland, and set up programs like Asian Health Services, Asian Community Mental Health Services, and lay the groundwork for the integration of the huge influx of immigrants that were beginning to show up in our communities after the Immigration and Naturalization Act in 1965. So the origin stories of groups like the Asian Law Caucus, AHS, Asian Community Mental Health, Asian Manpower Services, East Bay Asian Local Development Corporation, FAA, was the mission-driven participation by students, many of whom spent multiple years building these organizations, and some of whom stuck around through all their adult lives into retirement, so that we would have this basically a power base here in the East Bay for the Asian community. And you know, I was always very impressed by the role that the students who formed Asian Law Caucus played in helping these organizations become nonprofits. I was on the board of AHS for a while, and when I saw their articles of incorporation and their bylaws, they looked very much like ours, which I suspect was a template that the Law Caucus put together for the use of all of our organizations. We changed the name, changed the mission, and you know, pretty much we could get our groups incorporated, because at the time, nobody knew what a nonprofit was. And there were very few, if any, examples of nonprofits run by and for communities of color. And as Tu said, many of them are now surpassed their 45th anniversaries and will soon be 50. At the time, none of us knew how long these organizations would last, let alone become institutions in our communities. And some of them have gone on to be not only powerful on the local level, but have presence nationally. HS, of course, is one of those. But in honoring the legacy that Asian American Studies played in the formation of these nonprofits, I don't want us to forget the role of students themselves, because with or without the department, students did so much through the department and on their own to build these organizations. And even in building the Asian American Studies itself, I remember when students were doing the research and developing the curriculum and teaching the classes, because none of that existed. And were very involved in running the department itself. I was kind of blown away when I interviewed for my little library assistant job at Asian American Studies, when there were 15 people around the table for this little interview, and almost all of them were students. Students were also very involved in meeting directly with the administration to force the kind of institutionalization of the department at UC Berkeley and at many other campuses. I also want to acknowledge something that Tu said, that we were part of a larger movement, that the students were an extension of the civil rights movement. They were an extension of what we were all learning about colonialism and imperialism through the anti-war movement. And in particular, I believe that affirmative action itself played a role in bringing working class young people to college campuses, and kind of embedding in all the institutions that they had some role in starting the connection between our academic achievements and taking those skills directly to the community and spending that equity in the community itself. We did see some fall off in the 1990s in terms of student participation, at least in our organization, even though many student organizations took up the slack and developed programs within those student organizations to motivate young people to work in the community. But happily, in the 2020s, I remember getting students from the Cal Department of Public Health, where they seem to be linking physical and mental health to community empowerment and facilitated student participation in organizations like ours, and I'm assuming a lot of the other nonprofits in the East Bay. Thank you very much.
Lilian, thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and we appreciate you being a part of today's forum. Our final speaker in this segment is Miya Iwataki. She is a member of Nikkei Progressives and Vice President of Little Tokyo Historical Society. She was also a key champion in the grassroots movement for Japanese American redress and reparations. Miya, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Keith. I kind of feel like a fish out of water because I didn't go through Asian American studies, and I kind of came of age through the movement of the 60s and 70s, which was a really exciting time, as Lilian knows. It was a time when third world people, young people, women, Asian Americans found our voice. We built Serve the People programs, which were inspired by the Black Panthers' free childcare, free healthcare programs. Like we had an Asian American hardcore program for ex-addicts and felons who needed to know that they had a community to come home to. The first Asian Women's Center in the United States we started, and we did the first health fair. So it was really an exciting time. We built an Asian American movement fighting for liberation and social change, and we were no longer invisible or no longer going to be the checkbox marked other. It was a time of community building and a time of coalition building, and Asians were an integral part of the third world people's movement. It was the first time I actually really felt whole and empowered as a Japanese American, Asian American, a woman, and a member of the third world community. And we marched with the Panthers, the Brown Berets, American Indian movement, and students to free political prisoners, fight against drugs in our community, stop the war in Vietnam, stop imperialism, fight racism and male chauvinism. But a key issue was for the fight for meaningful education. So as people have talked about in 1968, energized by Black student and community activists, Black, Latino, and Asian students came together, formed the Third World Liberation Front, and kicked off that historical 5-month strike at San Francisco State. And I know we from LA had car caravans driving up there. It was, really, really inspiring. And of course, as people know, police came on campus, blood was spilled, people got their heads, smashed in, and people ended up doing some hard time also. But the first ever College of Ethnic Studies came out of it. And so this movement, led by students and community activists, won a major victory that changed the trajectory of colleges and universities throughout the country. And this is what students and community working together can achieve. And I see this as the legacy of Asian American studies. And as people have talked about, today we're living in a critical time, pandemics, an emboldened rise of white supremacy, attacks on the foundations of democracy like voting rights, a woman's right to choose. We're faced with the potential of war, and there's deepening divisions in our country. And now they're resurrecting the myth of the model minority to create as a wedge issue between AAPIs and other communities of color. And we're faced with the continuing anti-Asian hate and violence. And as people have talked about, we remember and commemorate the 6 Asian women workers who were shot and killed in the 2 spas in Atlanta, Georgia on this very date 1 year ago. So we cannot be bystanders. We need to be a part of the solution. And I believe that the conversation in Asian American studies needs to go beyond academics to activism, and many people have given great examples. Asian American studies came out of and needs to be connected with the community. And if there is to be a future of Asian American studies, we might want to ask ourselves these questions. How can Asian American studies be a tool for the future and help preserve and strengthen our communities? How can education expand the conversation today and prepare our next generation to be able to recognize and confront just injustice and to organize in the community? And does the study and discussion of our history as AAPI in America include the context of our shared histories as we share with other communities of color in the United States, and the impact of white supremacy and institutional racism on us? Sometimes I feel that some of the young people we see today haven't gotten the full history of Asian Americans in the United States and don't fully recognize the struggle and the blood we spilled to build our, programs and move to where we are today. So is that being discussed in Asian American studies? And what is the legacy of community engagement with third world or BIPOC solidarity that built Asian American studies? Is that evident today? And what kind of people are coming out of Asian American studies at Berkeley? What programs are you still conducting that are engaged in empowering the community? There was a time, I think we can criticize the left, because after the 60s and 70s and part of the 80s, I think that not enough of us went into Asian American studies. So it's not like we could stand back here and criticize. But I feel that there's, a coming back today. And in Little Tokyo, for example, we're fighting against gentrification. We're losing so many of our legacy businesses. In fact, during the pandemic, we lost 23 businesses. So community folks came together. We're trying to pull together a Little Tokyo Community Impact Fund, which is a socially responsible real estate fund, something we've never done. We had this fantastic graduate intern from urban studies that played such a big role in helping to staff and pull this project together to where it's at today. We recently, in the Little Tokyo Historical Society, learned about a fantastic pioneer, Sei Fuji, who was a civil rights and labor rights activist. He was a newspaper publisher. He was an attorney who, with his white partner, overturned the California alien land law. We did not know that about our history. We had a fantastic master's intern work with us. We published a book on Sei Fuji, and she's pulled together, the struggles we've had with, getting the published book, shipped back to us because of, the pandemic created all those delivery problems. And she helped outline a book launch and an education program for Sei Fuji and getting it into the universities. And I think that, there's so much opportunity and so much need right now. And for Asian American studies to direct students into meaningful internships with relevant and activist community organizations and filling some of the needs in the community. I think that's what we're looking for today. And again, looking at what's happening today, we cannot be a bystander. We need to be part of the solution. And I hope that Asian American Studies will be a part of that solution and we can work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Miya, so much. What a great way to conclude the presentations for today. I want to apologize to everybody. We're running a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to ask Professor Khatharya to share her closing remarks for today. And then we're going to play the preview of Jon Osaki's documentary, Making Waves, The Rise of Asian America, which is an upcoming documentary by Jon exploring the impact of Asian American studies programs across the country. He made this preview especially for us, so I hope that you can stay on after Professor shares her remarks and watch this important video. Dr.
Thank you, Keith. Good afternoon. First of all, on behalf of Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies, I would like to reiterate our special thanks to everyone who joined us today in this very important conversation, to those who worked in front and behind the scene to make this event possible, to the students, to community and alumni like Phil, Don, Jeff, Tu, Goya, Hannah, and many others for your unwavering support of AADS. It has become almost a cliche now to say that we're living in challenging times. But then again, Asian Americans have always been living in challenging times. The pandemic has exposed the disparities, inequities, disregard, and hate that never seem to diminish in our nation. These may come as revelations to inattentive minds, but to many in our Asian American communities and other vulnerable communities, these are lived realities that we've had to confront almost on a daily basis, extending back to the early days of Asian immigration. Some of the enduring stereotypes have become simply normalized. Over 5 decades and tomes of research and writing later, we are still battling the model minority myth. We are still absent in many of the discourses on race, equity, justice, and of course, belonging, given that the perpetual foreigner seems to be grafted onto our skin. Today marks the 1-year anniversary of the Atlanta shooting. It is a somber reminder of the challenges that we Asian Americans continue to face regardless of our ethnicity, class, gender, citizenship, or residency status. It is a powerful reminder that Asian American studies need not only to exist, but to thrive on our campus, on other campuses, nationwide, and at all grade levels. Asian American Studies was born of the community on and beyond this campus. As a field of study, a program, we may be able to grow, but we cannot thrive except through the harnessed strength and richness of the community. Because it is the community that feeds our intellect, that nurtures our students, and that inspires us to do more than be good academics. If we are living in a challenging time, we are also living in a changing time, as many have already underscored. Asian American Studies is needed now more than ever. And we need to be at the center of the local and national discourse so that we can contribute to changing the narrative and to build new narrative power, as Jeff proffers, so that collectively we can move this nation to where it can and needs to be, so that the rhetoric can actually reflect the reality. The vision that we ultimately seek to advance is not just of Asian American Studies or even Asian America, but of a new and more just and inclusive America. Asian American Studies is a gift, not just to Asian Americans. It is a gift to America. What Asian American Studies will be in the next 50 years, what it will be for our children and their children, what America's next generations will learn about America's more expansive history, whether inclusive excellence is an abstract concept or an integral part of our public educational mission, all of that is within our power to determine. Let's do it together. Thank you.
Hi everyone, Jon Osaki, Director of Making Waves, The Rise of Asian America. Very happy to be able to share this preview with you today. What you're about to see is very Berkeley centric, but the final film will look much different as we are profiling Asian American studies movements in Texas, Indiana, the Pacific Northwest, Michigan, Boston, and probably other areas. But we hope you enjoy what we have so far, and we look forward to sharing the final film with you in the fall of this year.
Berkeley, which is one of the largest and most distinguished universities in the world. And not a few people have been persuaded by the various irreverences still on view at Berkeley that there is a real threat of student mobilization for power.
On strike, stand down! On strike, stand down!
In 1968, I had just started UC Berkeley. The Third World Strike started, led by the Black leaders, and their influence was really from the Black Panther Party. What was amazing was this whole idea of we have an important story to tell, that our story has never been studied or learned. And it was not only the idea that the story should be learned by Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, but it should be learned by all people. It sparked this whole movement, even in Ivy League schools.
To be at UC Berkeley, the birthplace of the ethnic studies movement, along with SF State, is something I'm very proud of. There's a specific building, and there's other buildings actually on UC Berkeley that only have one door handle because protesters would chain the doors together with themselves, and so one door handle was taken off from a lot of the older buildings. And so whenever I walk by a building like that, I kind of smile to myself, and I'm like, change happened here.
I was raised in a family that was very much keep your head down, don't make waves. If your head sticks up, it's going to be the one that gets lopped off. So when I was a student at UC Berkeley, I did take ethnic study classes, and it really just helped me understand the world better. So when I chose this profession of social welfare, totally not acceptable by my parents, not understood. They didn't get it at all. And yet I was struck with the idealism of really being committed to making change.
I took Asian American Studies 20A with Professor Michael Omi. The title of the course is Intro to the History of Asians in the United States. We were all there in some capacity because we had this longing and this desire to be seen in our curriculum.
What I recall from the Panthers and the Black students was they had the clearest understanding of why they were doing this. Their ideas were so much more developed, especially the need for Asian, Black, and Hispanic studies, but also the need to start going back to the community, to start building community organizations and institutions. And that's what we did.
JSA's roots started out of the activist students at UC Berkeley and some of the surrounding local colleges, where they got together and identified the need for supporting their older adults in their communities. It strikes me how a group of such young, motivated, energetic individuals who had no experience community organizing or running a nonprofit or raising money could get all of this launched. And not only did they start JSA, but they started 3 other senior service organizations in the East Bay. Those programs, including JSA, continue to function today. And if you think throughout all the years, thousands of families have been helped.
The issues that we see today with all the Black Lives Matter, violence against Asians, a lot of these issues are the same things I faced with 50 years ago.
While I think all of the positive outgrowths from the civil rights movement led to some great programs and action, I think we've taken our foot off the gas pedal. And when you do that, you regress. So all we have to do is look at what's happened in the past couple of years to see how divided we are as a country.
I think that since UC Berkeley is situated in such a particular time of social turmoil where there's a pandemic, there's the January 6th riot, there's the murder of George Floyd, we're really put into question about what we should value and what we put value in. And I think part of that question needs to be that UC Berkeley was the epicenter of the Third World Liberation Front and the ethnic studies movement. And I don't think Berkeley should take that lightly, in the sense that they should be leading by example and should set a precedent for other institutions that are just perhaps starting their Asian American Studies departments.
With the recent rise in violence against Asian Americans, activists and students across the country are asking administrators to do more to support Asian American studies and programs.
Knowing that there's actually Asian American studies that exists gave me that confidence and that affirmation that studying myself, studying my community, that's important too. And that I'm allowed to do that, and I'm allowed to take up space and be loud about issues in my community. My Asian American literature forced us to reckon with our Asian American identities. After we read Buddha in the Attic, which, if you don't know, Buddha in the Attic is about picture brides. And my great-grandmother, Wakano Mukai, she was a picture bride. And so one of the writing prompts had us write to a person. So I wrote a letter to my great-grandmother. To my great-grandmother, Wakano Mukai. Ise, Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei. 4 generations apart, yet I feel connected to you more than ever. I wonder what you were like and how you carried yourself. But most of all, I wonder whether you would have liked me and the woman I am today. Have I made you proud? I only know about you from what information I'm able to ask of my father. I gave your name a search through the internet, allowing me to find a chapter of a book dedicated to you in Fascinating Women in California History, written by Alton Pryor, an old white man. Someone who is of no relation to you knows more about you than I did. I am ashamed. I keep rereading the chapter, finding out more clues that could help me piece together what your life was like. I wonder what it was like to leave your family behind in Hiroshima. I wonder what you felt when you saw my great-grandfather Buntaro for the first time outside of his picture. And I wonder if you were upset when you found out he was only a 4'6" man. Or when you saw the small shack he lived in at the edge of a strawberry field. I wonder how you felt on February 19th, 1942, when Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. I wonder how you felt on August 6, 1945, the day Hiroshima was bombed. I wonder how much your heart hurt when you learned that your country you had left behind had been decimated by the one you called home, or at least tried to. Innocent family, civilians, killed and burned alive. I can only imagine the resentment you felt towards the country you resided in and locked you in a horse stall. Is that the same resentment I feel right now? I feel that I have miserably failed you, my great-grandmother. I feel such pain for all that you have lost. You came to America for a better life for yourself, and in doing so laid the seeds for your family to do the same in America. I will make sure that your children and grandchildren know your story and everything you went through. I will make sure that you are not just a chapter in a book. I will make sure that you are not forgotten. Okaga Samade. I am who I am because of you. Your great-granddaughter, Hanako Mukai.
That was beautiful.
Thank you. Sorry. Oh, ooh.
So, if you had to, would you like chain yourself to the doors
Yeah,
with these programs?
I would. If they were threatening to cut like the department, I would be out there.
I want to thank Jon Osaki for making that video available for us today, and just want to conclude by thanking the Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies program at UC Berkeley, Asian American Research Center, very special thank you to our presenters today. Thank you, Deborah and Max, for running today's Zoom. There's a long list of people who helped us put this event together, and I hope that you will visit asianamerica.vision. The website has a list of the folks that were involved in putting this on. And finally, today's event would not be possible without a generous grant from the Minami Tamaki, Yamauchi Kwok, and Lee Foundation. We thank the MTYKL Foundation and especially Donald Tamaki for their and his support. That concludes today's forum. We will send out a post-event email and hopefully address any outstanding questions that you had that we weren't able to answer today. Thank you so much for being with us today.